March 1944. The Pacific jungle steamed under the morning sun as US soldiers advanced past the smoking wreckage of battle. There, half buried in sand and palm fronds, they found it. A Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank. Its armor, thinner than a truck's door, was shredded with holes from .50 caliber fire. The men stood around it in disbelief, some laughing, others shaking their heads. They had expected a fortress of steel. Instead, they found a machine so frail that bullets meant for infantry had torn through it with ease. The Hago had once carried Japan's hopes of armored dominance, rolling across China and Malaya with speed and confidence. But by the time it faced America's Shermans and anti-tank guns, it was hopelessly outmatched, a relic of another era still being sent into modern war. What these soldiers witnessed that morning was more than a wrecked tank. It was the visible collapse of Japan's wartime illusion, pierced and exposed by American firepower. January 26, 1942. Balanga Road, Bataan Peninsula. Rain steamed from the asphalt, pooling in shell craters where palm fronds floated like dead fish. Private Harold Jennings crouched behind a mangled truck, the metal still hot from machine gun fire, when the jungle ahead began to move. Branches snapped. A narrow, snub-nosed tank pushed through the trees, rivets catching the light. Its treads whined on the wet road, throwing mud across the ditch. Jennings raised his binoculars. The vehicle looked more like a farm tractor with armor plates than a tank. He counted 3 men inside, a driver hunched over the controls, a loader feeding rounds into a short 37mm gun, and a commander leaning from the hatch with goggles fogged by rain. He shouted something Jennings couldn't hear before the first burst from an American .50 caliber tore through the front plate. The tank shuddered, stopped, and caught fire. When the smoke cleared, the Marines walked forward and stared. The rounds had entered one side and exited cleanly through the other. The tank's thin armor had not deflected a single bullet. The men laughed in disbelief. "This is what they sent against us?" one asked. It was the first captured Japanese Type 95 Heigo light tank US forces had ever seen in combat, and within minutes it had revealed the truth about Japan's armored power. It was a myth built on sheet metal. The Hago was born from compromise. In 1933, while Western nations designed heavy tanks to survive artillery fire, Japan's Army Technical Bureau faced a harsher reality. Japan's steel production ranked 17th in the world, its oil reserves nearly non-existent. Its officers dreamed of empire across Asia, but they could not build the machines required to seize it. So they redefined the word tank. To the Japanese planners, armor did not need to resist direct fire if it could move swiftly enough to avoid it. Mobility and morale would replace thickness and horsepower. The result was a 7-ton vehicle barely 16 feet long, powered by a 110 horsepower diesel engine, thinly plated with 12 millimeters of steel at the front and 9 on the sides. 3 men crewed it. No radio. No internal communication system beyond shouted orders and hand signals. It carried a 37mm gun capable of piercing an inch of armor at 500 yards, adequate against Chinese infantry positions in 1937, useless against modern tanks by 1942. Early trials in Manchuria gave Japanese officers false confidence. Against lightly armed Chinese forces, the Hago performed well. It crossed paddy fields where heavier European tanks would have sunk, climbed wooden bridges without collapsing them, and advanced with such speed that infantry struggled to keep pace. Reports from the 1937 Beijing-Tianjin offensive praised its reliability and spirit. Those words became doctrine. Spirit was the core of Japanese armored philosophy, faith that willpower could fill the gaps left by steel. The army declared the Hago a model for expansion and ordered Mitsubishi to produce hundreds. By 1940, it was the backbone of every armored regiment in Asia. The first foreign officers to study the Hago called it a tank for an empire without awe. Its thinness was a necessity of geography. Japanese bridges could bear no more than 10 tons, and its merchant fleet required light loads to supply far-flung islands. Every design decision was dictated by scarcity. Engineers reduced plate thickness, simplified suspension, and used rivets instead of welding, because skilled welders were rare. The machine that emerged was elegant on paper and fragile in reality. But in 1939, when Japanese forces clashed with the Soviets at Khalkhin Gol, reality arrived. The Hagos met Russian BT-7 tanks, armed with 45mm guns. In minutes, they were destroyed at ranges beyond their own sight. Out of 73 Japanese tanks engaged, 45 were lost. The army concluded the defeat was not mechanical, but moral. Instead of designing new armor, they taught crews to attack closer, faster, with greater zeal. The machine would remain unchanged. When Japan struck the United States and Britain in December 1941, the Hago rode the first waves of invasion. At Kota Baru in Malaya, 10 tanks landed before dawn, their tracks wrapped in canvas to grip the sand. British troops, unaware Japan possessed armor capable of tropical warfare, were taken by surprise. The Hagos advanced through barbed wire and pushed the defenders off the beach. In Singapore, one squadron crossed a causeway under artillery fire. Its commander described in dispatches as calm and smiling under enemy fire. Those early victories cemented the tank's myth as unstoppable. In truth, its opponents had no anti-tank weapons. Against Western armor, it would be hopeless. Bataan was where the illusion died. The American retreat toward the peninsula brought scattered battalions of infantry and cavalry together with hastily assembled defensive lines. Among their weapons was a collection of Browning .50 caliber machine guns intended for airfields. They mounted them on trucks and sandbag walls. On January the 26th, a platoon of Hagos rolled down the main road supported by infantry. The Browning crews opened fire at 150 yards. The first burst punched through the lead tank's front plate and ignited the diesel tank. The blast blew the turret clear off. The second tank turned sideways to retreat, its armor split at the rivets. A third was stopped by a grenade through the engine grill. Within 10 minutes, the attack was over. Of the 9 vehicles that began the assault, only 1 escaped. Captured intelligence reports from the 31st Infantry record an American remark: enemy armor of poor quality can be defeated by .50 caliber fire. When the wrecks were examined later, engineers found that the armor was not rolled homogeneous steel, but soft plate of uneven hardness. Under a microscope, it showed air bubbles and impurities, evidence of low temperature forging from small workshops without modern furnaces. The rivets, meant to hold the plates together, became second-order, to shrapnel when struck. Autopsy of crew remains showed puncture wounds from flying rivets rather than bullets. One American ordnance officer remarked that a Hago was dangerous mainly to its own crew. By 1942, Japan's armored corps knew its limitations, but industrial inertia and shortage of materials made replacement impossible. Plans for the upgunned Type 97 Chiha were delayed by steel allocation to naval shipyards, so the Ha-Go remained the standard tank throughout the war. Between 1935 and 1945, 2,378 units were built. Each was hand-assembled, each an artifact of an industrial system stretched beyond its limits. On Guadalcanal in August 1942, the Americans met them again. 14 Ha-Gos launched a night attack against marine positions along the Matanikau River. They advanced without infantry support into marshland. Flare light revealed their silhouettes. 50 caliber guns and 37 mm anti-tank weapons opened fire. By morning, every tank was destroyed. Photographs show them still in formation, as if frozen mid-charge. The Marines salvaged one intact vehicle and sent it to Henderson Field for testing. The armor was so thin that technicians used a hand saw to remove a panel. They painted on its side in chalk, "Coffin for 3." At the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Maryland, captured Ha-Gos were fired upon with standard U.S. infantry weapons. The 30-006 rifle round penetrated the side plate at close range. The 50 caliber round penetrated both sides. Test observers recorded the results in measured language. Armor ineffective against all calibers of U.S. ammunition. Yet beneath the technical phrasing was astonishment. Never had American officers encountered a tank so light, so vulnerable, and so believed in by its crews. For those crews, service inside the Ha-Go was a discipline of faith. The interior was cramped to the point that men entered one at a time through the hatch and squatted in place before the next could follow. Heat from the engine made breathing difficult. Temperature measurements in Burma recorded 135 degrees Fahrenheit inside. Noise levels were so high that crews communicated with kicks on each other's backs. Many wrote farewell letters before missions, fully aware they were unlikely to survive first contact. The psychology behind that obedience stemmed from Japan's interwar education system. Officers had been taught that technological inferiority could be overcome by moral superiority. In training manuals for tank units issued in 1941, a line reads, "Armor is the shell of the warrior. The true protection is the heart." American analysts who translated it after the war were divided between admiration and pity. By 1944, the Ha-Go had become obsolete even by Japanese standards. Yet it continued to fight in New Guinea, Saipan, Guam, Leyte, and Okinawa. On Saipan, the largest tank battle of the Pacific unfolded under moonlight on July 16, 1944. 36 Ha-Gos advanced in line abreast across sugarcane fields toward marine positions near Tanapag. They were spotted by reconnaissance planes and met by Sherman tanks of the 4th Marine Division. The resulting engagement lasted 20 minutes. 31 Ha-Gos were destroyed. The remainder retreated into the jungle. A Marine after-action report read, "Enemy armor appeared to disintegrate under fire." War correspondent Robert Sherrod described the field the next morning. The Japanese tanks lay scattered like punctured toys, their metal peeled back as if by a can opener. Some were so thin we could see sunlight through them. Photographs as published in Life magazine show Marines laughing beside wrecks, a mix of relief and disbelief. They had feared a formidable enemy. Instead, they found evidence of industrial poverty. For American soldiers who examined the wrecks, the lesson was immediate. The war was not merely a clash of armies, but of manufacturing systems. The Ha-Go was handmade in small batches. The Sherman was mass-produced on Detroit assembly lines that could build one every day. Each rivet on the Ha-Go represented labor hours Japan could not spare. Each bullet hole represented proof that industrial faith alone could not win a mechanized war. By Okinawa in 1945, Japan's tank units had ceased to exist as mobile forces. Hagos were dug in as static bunkers, their turrets barely visible above the earth. When American flamethrower teams cleared those positions, they often found crews still at their stations, hands fused to controls. In one tunnel near Shuri, a tank had been buried entirely except for its gun barrel. It had fired until its ammunition was gone, then sat silent for days before being overrun. The tank was later excavated. The crew had sealed the hatch from inside. They had never attempted to escape. After the surrender, U.S. Army technical teams surveyed Japan's remaining armor production. They found hundreds of incomplete Hagos stored in warehouses across Honshu, many missing engines or guns. The reports noted that Japan lacked manganese and nickel for proper steel alloys. Some armor plates were cut from ship boilers, others from scrap. The factories themselves were workshops rather than assembly lines. The average tank took 3,000 man-hours to produce. An American M4 required 1,000. The difference was not efficiency, but civilization. Occupation officers summarized the finding bluntly. Japanese tank development arrested at 1935 level. Industrial limitations prevent modernization. Behind those words lay the ruin of a nation that had tried to fight modern war with pre-industrial tools. In 1946, a Hago was shipped to Aberdeen for display. The curator described it as a relic of courage without capacity. Visitors were struck by its size, barely shoulder-high to an average man. Children could climb into the driver's seat. The armor still bore the marks of .50 caliber impacts, entry holes clean and circular, exit holes jagged like torn paper. Each was a signature of the imbalance between two worlds, one powered by belief, the other by electricity. Survivors from Japan's 9th Tank Regiment later spoke with unusual frankness. Corporal Hiroshi Saito, interviewed in 1953, recalled, "We called it the Firefly. When hit, it always burned. We respected it like a comrade that would die before us." Asked what he thought of American tanks, he replied, "They were factories on tracks. We had workshops on wheels." For U.S. veterans, the memory carried a different weight. Many recalled laughter when they first saw the Hago destroyed, but few laughed later. Marine gunner Tom Reed, who had knocked out 2 on Tarawa, said in a 1962 interview, "At first we thought it was funny, a tank made of tin. But when you saw the men inside, you stopped laughing. They fought as hard as anyone. They just didn't stand a chance." The Hago's remains, scattered across the Pacific, became silent memorials to the moment faith met physics. On Saipan, rusted hulls still lie half-buried in sugarcane. In the Philippines, villagers used turret rings as well covers. On Okinawa, a Hago preserved near Shuri Castle bears an inscription added by U.S. engineers. "Armor of courage, proof of futility." What the Americans learned from it went beyond weapon design. The Hago revealed how far industrial modernity had widened the gap between nations. Japan's engineers had crafted a vehicle suited for colonial policing. The United States built one to conquer continents. One ran on willpower, the other on octane. When they met, the outcome was mathematical. For every Hago destroyed, the U.S. replaced a Sherman within days. Japan could not replace even one. In 1944, American shipyards launched 2,700 Liberty ships. Japan built 20. The war had ceased to be a contest of bravery long before it ended. In the National Archives today, an engineer's report from 1945 summarizes the Hago with bureaucratic detachment. Light tank Type 95. Armor insufficient against all Allied weapons. Continued use demonstrates reliance on morale rather than material. It reads like a post-mortem for an idea. The men who fought in them carried that idea to their deaths. They believed spirit could substitute for steel, that courage could withstand fire. The Pacific proved otherwise. When Private Jennings was interviewed decades later, he brought out a bent triangle of metal from his footlocker, a fragment of that first Hago his unit had destroyed on Bataan. He held it up to the light. "You could bend it with your hands," he said softly. "That's when we knew how this war would go." They were brave, but they were fighting with tin. The Hago light tank was more than a failed weapon. It was a reflection of a nation's limits, a machine built from belief in a world already defined by production. Every bullet that passed through its armor carried a message from the modern age to the past, that no amount of courage could withstand a .50 caliber truth. August 21st, 1942. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The humid air hung thick with the scent of mud, cordite, and decay. For days, the rain had fallen without mercy, turning the red clay trails into rivers of sludge. American Marines of the 1st Division crouched in their foxholes, their rifles slick with moisture, their nerves drawn thin. Across the jungle, the low whine of engines echoed, something mechanical, something they hadn't yet faced on this island. The sound grew louder, churning through the trees like an approaching storm. Then came the grinding of metal against rock. Private William McEwen, barely 20 years old, raised his head just enough to see the impossible. A squat, boxy silhouette emerging from the foliage, its riveted armor glinting faintly under the grey dawn. A Japanese tank, the first they had seen on Guadalcanal. For months, rumors had circulated that Japan's armored divisions were poorly equipped for jungle warfare. Yet to the men of the 1st Marine Division, the sight of a tank, any tank, sent a chill down their spines. Most had landed on Guadalcanal, with rifles, grenades, and light machine guns. Few had ever fired at armor. The M2.50 caliber Browning machine gun was their heaviest weapon in most outposts, mounted on tripods or lashed to sandbags. When the Hago appeared, its 37mm gun traversing slowly, even that seemed inadequate. The Saipan 995 Hago weighed just 7 tons, its armor no thicker than a half-inch at the sides. It was designed for speed and mobility in China's open plains, not the tangled jungles of the South Pacific. Yet the Japanese believed its psychological effect would be decisive. The tanks belonged to Colonel Akinosuke Oka's detachment. Light armor units of the 2nd Division rushed from Rabaul to crush the American beachhead before it could take root. The Imperial Command had underestimated the Americans' resolve, imagining them still stunned from Pearl Harbor and the Philippines. At dawn, 3 Hago tanks advanced down the narrow jungle trail near the Tanaru River, their treads grinding over fallen logs. Behind them, hundreds of infantrymen followed. The Marines, dug in along the Lunga perimeter, had prepared crude obstacles, fallen palm trunks, shallow trenches, and a handful of anti-tank mines scavenged from abandoned army stockpiles. But in most positions, their only defense was courage and a handful of .50 caliber guns. Sergeant Charles Red Martin ordered his men to hold fire until the tanks were close. The jungle muffled their approach, the vines shaking as the Hargos pushed forward. The lead tank's commander, standing exposed in the open hatch, waved his sword as if leading a parade. When the first 50 caliber gun opened fire, the effect was immediate and shocking. The heavy rounds slammed into the Hargos' thin armor with a sound like hammer blows against sheet metal. Sparks burst from the impact points, then holes appeared. Clean, ragged holes punched straight through the plating. The machine gunner, Corporal Harold Beasley, kept his finger on the trigger, walking his fire across the tank's mail. To the disbelief of every Marine watching, the Japanese tank shuddered, smoked, and stopped. A second burst ripped through the turret, and the commander collapsed half out of the hatch, his sword tumbling into the mud. Beasley's gun jammed. He cleared it with shaking hands, unable to stop laughing. "It's like shooting through tin," he shouted to Martin. "Tin!" The phrase spread along the line. Fear dissolved into adrenaline-fueled disbelief. The second Hargo lurched forward, its machine gun chattering, bullets hissing through palm leaves. Beasley's gun barked again. Within seconds, the second tank burst into flames. The Marines who had braced for a slaughter now watched the Japanese armor crumble under fire they had believed useless. By midday, the battle at the Tanaru had turned into a massacre. Of the Japanese tanks committed, all 3 were destroyed. 2 by .50 caliber fire, 1 by a grenade dropped into an open hatch by Private First Class Albert Schmid. Japanese infantry, deprived of their armored spearhead, broke against the Marine perimeter in waves. When the shooting finally stopped, more than 700 Japanese soldiers lay dead along the riverbank. The Marines suffered fewer than 50 casualties. In the aftermath, Marines gathered around the smoldering wrecks, astonished. The tanks looked pitiful. Rivets popped out like buttons. Armor plates curled inward where the .50 caliber rounds had punched through. One Marine joked that even a Boy Scout knife could pierce the thing. A war correspondent with the division, Richard Tregaskis, later wrote that the men's laughter seemed almost hysterical. They had expected monsters, he recorded. Instead, they found toys. The Hargo's vulnerability became a legend overnight. Intelligence officers inspected the wrecks, measuring armor thickness and taking photographs. The findings were circulated across the Pacific within weeks. Type 95 light tank. Armor, 6 to 12 millimeters. Vulnerable to .50 caliber. Anti-tank rifle. Hand grenades. The report concluded with almost clinical understatement. Not recommended for further concern. For the Marines, that knowledge was liberation. Until then, tanks had represented an unassailable symbol of modern war. Rolling fortresses that had broken armies across Europe. To discover that the enemy's armor could be torn open by a machine gun changed everything. It stripped away the myth of Japanese invincibility. It was like the spell was broken, recalled Lieutenant John Basilone, later to earn the Medal of Honor. We stopped seeing them as supermen and started seeing them as targets. Yet the Hargo's failure wasn't merely a matter of design. It was a symptom of Japan's entire industrial imbalance. Before the war, Japanese engineers had focused on light, fuel-efficient vehicles that could be transported easily by ship and repaired in primitive field conditions. Their doctrine envisioned tanks as infantry support weapons, not independent spearheads. The Type 95's 37mm gun, once adequate against Chinese warlords' outdated armor, was hopelessly outclassed by 1942. Its engine, a 120-horsepower diesel, gave it a top speed of 28 miles per hour. but little power to climb or maneuver through jungle terrain. When American armor finally arrived, M3 Stuarts and later M4 Shermans, the difference was humiliating. In one skirmish on the northern ridges of Guadalcanal, a single M3 encountered 2 Hogos attempting to flank a Marine position. The Stuart fired once from 300 yards. The 37mm armor-piercing shell struck the lead Hago, passed clean through its front plate, and set off its ammunition rack. The second tank retreated, only to be caught in crossfire from Marine .50 calibers. Both were reduced to burning husks within minutes. The Marines joked afterward that the Japanese tanks had been made from rice paper and optimism. But beneath the laughter lay something deeper. The encounter revealed, in miniature, the industrial asymmetry that defined the Pacific War. America's war machine could produce a fully equipped M4 Sherman in 10 days. Japan, by contrast, could barely replace its losses. The entire empire produced fewer than 2,500 Type 95s over the course of the war, roughly the number of American tanks built in a single month by mid-1943. The Guadalcanal engagement was not merely a tactical victory. It was an industrial revelation. In diaries recovered from the battlefield, Japanese soldiers expressed their own disbelief. Corporal Sato Yoshiharu wrote, "Our tanks were like toys before their fire. The enemy's bullets pierced us as if our armor were paper. We felt shame, but greater fear, that our emperor had sent us into battle with children's weapons." His words, later translated by Allied intelligence, mirrored what countless other prisoners would confirm in the months ahead. The myth of technological parity was dead. The Battle of the Tenaru and the destruction of the Hagos marked the beginning of a shift in Marine morale. Guadalcanal had been hell, malaria, hunger, isolation, but now the men believed in victory. Their enemy bled, burned, and broke like any other. When reinforcements arrived in late September, veterans pointed proudly to the rusting tank carcasses near the Lunga River. "That's what they brought against us," one sergeant said to a fresh recruit, slapping the hull of a Hago riddled with bullet holes. "You tell me who's winning." In Washington, the reports caused quiet astonishment. Intelligence officers who had feared Japanese armor on Pacific Islands now re-evaluated the threat. The War Department concluded that the enemy's industry lacked the steel reserves and production capacity to field heavier tanks in significant numbers. Japan's reliance on light armor stemmed not from doctrine alone, but from material scarcity. Their shipyards needed every ton of steel for carriers and destroyers. Their tank factories relied on recycled steel and manual assembly. Even before the bombing campaign began, Japan's industrial ceiling had already been reached. For the Marines on Guadalcanal, however, this was all abstract. Their understanding of the enemy came through experience, the taste of salt air, the recoil of the Browning, the smell of burning diesel. To them, victory was measured in shattered hulls and silenced guns. On patrols through the jungle, they found more wrecks. Hagos abandoned in ravines or half submerged in mud, their crews long gone. Some had been destroyed by their own soldiers to prevent capture. Others had simply broken down, victims of weak transmissions and tropical humidity. The Marines turned them into souvenirs. Helmets, periscopes, even whole hatches were shipped home as proof that the mighty Japanese tank was nothing but a death trap. At night, campfires flickered along the Lunga perimeter. The men told stories, how Beasley's first burst had lit up the jungle, how the tank commander's sword still lay somewhere in the mud, how one Marine had carved his initials into a melted track link. The laughter carried through the dark, mingling with the drone of mosquitoes and the distant thump of artillery. "If this is what they call armor," one man said, "I'd hate to see their helmets." But not everyone laughed. Colonel Alexander Vandergrift, commanding the division, studied the wrecks with a sober eye. He understood what the Hago represented, a sign of Japan's overreach, its belief that morale could substitute for machinery. "They thought courage could defeat steel," he remarked. "They were wrong." But we should never make the same mistake. His words would echo through Marine Corps doctrine for years to come. The encounter at Guadalcanal reshaped Allied intelligence on Japan's capabilities. Photographs of the destroyed tanks appeared in training manuals, with captions emphasizing their weakness and thin armor. Recruits across the Pacific studied them, learning exactly where to aim: at the sides, the rear, the turret ring. Confidence replaced fear. By the time American forces landed on Tarawa, Saipan, and Peleliu, Marines no longer hesitated when they heard the rumble of treads. They knew that behind that sound was not invincibility, but vulnerability. The Type 95 would continue to appear throughout the war, its presence increasingly tragic. At Tarawa, they burned under naval shell fire. On Saipan, they were crushed by Shermans before their crews even saw the enemy. On Okinawa, they charged hopelessly against bazookas and aircraft rockets. By 1945, the Hago had become a symbol of a bygone era, a relic of an empire that could not adapt. Yet its first appearance on Guadalcanal remains one of the war's defining psychological moments. In that steaming jungle, far from the industrial cities that built their weapons, a handful of Marines discovered the truth of modern warfare. Technology and mass production would decide the future, not slogans or spirit. The laughter that followed the Hago's destruction was not mockery alone. It was the sound of realization, of men understanding for the first time that America's industrial might was unmatched. After the battle, the Marines buried their dead, cleaned their guns, and prepared for the next assault. The rusting shells of the Hagos remained where they had fallen, their paint blistered by tropical heat. Vines crept over the turrets, ferns sprouted from open hatches. Years later, when historians returned to Guadalcanal, they found one of the tanks still half submerged near the Tanaru, its hull pocked with bullet holes, its gun drooping like a broken limb. Inside, a faded emblem, a red chrysanthemum, still clung to the steel. It had once symbolized imperial power. Now, it was just rust. In the end, the Hago's story was not one of bravery or design, but of illusion. It embodied Japan's misplaced faith in the old ways, the belief that willpower could replace industry, that courage could outweigh machinery. The Marines who faced it learned something lasting. Wars are not won by the loudest propaganda, but by the quiet hum of factories thousands of miles away. The .50 caliber guns that tore through its armor were not just weapons. They were symbols of an industrial giant awakening, of a nation whose resources and technology would soon crush the Axis under sheer volume and precision. The battle for Guadalcanal continued for months, grinding through jungle and ridge, disease and starvation. But the fear that had haunted the first landings was gone. The Marines had looked into the face of Japan's armored might and found it hollow. From then on, every clattering engine in the distance, every tank silhouette in the dusk, carried not terror, but grim amusement. They had seen the truth written in steel and smoke. America's bullets could pierce not just armor, but the myth of invincibility itself. The wrecked Ha-Go by the Tenaru became a monument of sorts. Soldiers posed beside it for photographs, their sleeves rolled up, cigarettes in hand, grinning like boys beside a conquered beast. Some carved their names into its sides, others simply looked and shook their heads. It was more than a trophy. It was proof that they could win. By the time the campaign ended, in February 1943, Guadalcanal was a graveyard of machines. Japanese tanks lay rusting beside crashed Zeros and shattered artillery. Mute witnesses to a war Japan could no longer sustain. For the Marines, the memory of that first encounter never faded. Whenever new replacements arrived in later campaigns, the veterans would tell them the story. How the tanks came roaring out of the jungle, how everyone thought they were doomed, how the .50 calls roared back, and how they all laughed when they saw the bullets go straight through. In the Pacific jungles, where death was constant and victory uncertain, that laughter mattered. It wasn't cruelty. It was defiance. It was the sound of men realizing that the tide had turned, that the empire which had once seemed unstoppable could bleed, burn, and break like any other. The Ha-Go was meant to terrify. Instead, it became a punchline, a story Marines would tell for the rest of their lives about the day they stopped being afraid. June 16th, 1944. The island of Saipan burned beneath a white Pacific sun. Black plumes of smoke twisted into the sky as American shells hammered the Japanese defenses along the southern ridges. The beaches, littered with wrecked landing craft and shattered palm trunks, had become America's newest battlefield. For 2 days, the 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions had clawed their way inland through rice paddies and sugarcane fields, trading lives for every yard. And somewhere beyond those fields, hidden behind coral ridges and shattered villages, Japanese tank crews were preparing the largest armored counterattack the Pacific War would ever see. The night before the assault, inside a dugout near Lake Susupe, Lieutenant Colonel Goto Saichi addressed his men. 50 tanks from the 9th Tank Regiment waited outside. Type 97 Chiha mediums and the lighter Type 95 Hagos that had survived the voyage from the home islands. Goto's face was drawn and hollow. The Imperial Command had given him one order: throw the Americans back into the sea. It was an impossible task. The US had already landed more than 60,000 troops, supported by naval gunfire and air superiority. But surrender was unthinkable. Japan's army doctrine demanded banzai, total attack, regardless of odds. As darkness fell, tank crews prepared their machines. The Hagos, obsolete even by 1942 standards, now looked like relics among the Marines' hulking M4 Shermans. Their thin plates were dented, engines coughing from overuse, tracks patched with salvaged links. Some lacked radios. Commands would be relayed by hand signals or the waving of swords. Mechanics wrapped their wrists in rags to handle the overheated engines. One Ha-Go commander, Sergeant Hiroshi Kameda, wrote in his diary that night, "We know this is death. But we must attack. It is the Emperor's wish. If I burn tomorrow, it will be as a warrior." The Marines did not know the scale of what was coming. Along the Aslito airfield perimeter, tankers from the 2nd Marine Division had just finished refueling their Shermans. Private First Class Robert Ford leaned against his tank, smoking under a moon that shimmered through drifting ash. In the distance, the island glowed with fire. "They're not done yet," his sergeant muttered. They could hear engines rumbling somewhere beyond the ridges, faint and rhythmic like a heartbeat beneath the jungle. Shortly after 3 a.m., the first sounds reached the American lines. Metal clanked against coral. Then came the rising roar of engines, dozens at once. Tracers sliced the darkness as Japanese mortars opened up, followed by the guttural cry of banzai, the word echoing across the plain like a wave breaking on stone. Out of the darkness, silhouettes appeared. Tanks, dozens of them, their headlights blacked out, guns flashing. Behind them ran hundreds of infantry, bayonets glinting in the moonlight. The Marines opened fire. Machine guns swept the field, ripping through the first ranks. Flares burst overhead, bathing the landscape in harsh white light. And then the Shermans answered. Their Muha 75mm guns fired point blank into the oncoming armor. The first shell struck a Hargo in the turret ring, blowing it open like a tin can. The second round caught a Chiha mid-turn and sent its turret flying. Within minutes, the battlefield was chaos. The Hargos advanced bravely, but hopelessly. Their 37mm guns pinged harmlessly off Sherman hulls, sparks dancing across the armor. When they tried to close the distance, 50 caliber machine guns tore through them, punching holes straight through both sides. The thin diesel fumes of burning Japanese tanks filled the air. Ford's Sherman fired again and again, each recoil rocking the vehicle like a heartbeat. "They came straight at us," he wrote later. "Not one of them tried to flank or hide. Just a line of them, driving into fire. It was suicide on treads." By 3:30 a.m., the Japanese formation had disintegrated. Flames rolled across the sugarcane. The Marines could see tanks burning like paper lanterns, ammunition cooking off in bright blossoms. The surviving infantry threw themselves against the American lines, screaming, hurling grenades, charging into machine gun fire. Most never made it within 10 yards. When dawn came, the battlefield was carpeted with wrecks and bodies. 50 tanks had been destroyed, 30 of them Hargos. It was the last time Japanese armor would ever launch a massed attack in the Pacific. When the sun rose, the Marines climbed out of their foxholes and stared in disbelief. The plain below looked like a scrapyard. Blackened Hargos lay at odd angles, their turrets blown away, their tracks twisted into ribbons. Some had melted into the coral. Others had been shredded so completely that the crews were still visible, burned in place. A few tanks had collided in the confusion, locked together like corpses in an embrace. It looked like someone had poured hell onto the island, recalled Corporal Jack O'Rourke. And all those little tanks just vanished under it. American photographers documented the carnage. The images would later appear in Life magazine, rows of destroyed Japanese tanks under captions that read, "The end of Japan's armor." The Hargo's fragile design had been exposed before on Guadalcanal and Tarawa, but never on this scale. Saipan's open fields offered no cover, no escape. Against American firepower, the tanks were death traps. The thin plates that once promised mobility now guaranteed immolation. In the following days, Marines picked through the wreckage. They pried open hatches, recovering documents, diaries, and weapons. Many of the Hargos had been hit multiple times, riddled with .50 caliber and 75mm holes. The heat had fused some crews to their seats. Lieutenant George Kinney, an ordnance officer, examined one wreck and noted that a single armor plate had been penetrated by 6 separate rounds. "There was nothing left to test," he wrote in his report. "The armor behaved like soft steel." it folded instead of shattering. For the Marines who had faced the charge, the memory was surreal. At first, the assault had seemed terrifying, an ocean of metal and shouting men charging through the darkness. But once the tanks began exploding, fear gave way to disbelief, and disbelief to grim laughter. Ford remembered hearing one Marine shout, "They're made of beer cans," before another burst into fire. Even amid the horror, the absurdity was undeniable. "They kept coming," Ford wrote. "We stopped counting the hits." It was like they didn't know their tanks couldn't stop our shells. In Tokyo, news of the disaster reached Imperial headquarters within days. The 9th Tank Regiment had been annihilated. Every officer above the rank of captain was dead. The Emperor was told that the unit had fought honorably to the last. But within the army, there was panic. The Saipan Counterattack had been meant to prove that Japanese spirit could overcome American technology. Instead, it confirmed the opposite. For the first time, the High Command admitted privately that Japan's armor was obsolete. The Ha-Go had been designed in the 1930s for a different kind of war, a colonial war fought across the plains of Manchuria and the roads of China. In those early campaigns, its speed and lightweight had been assets, but on Saipan, those same traits became liabilities. Its 12mm side armor was thinner than a US half-track. Its gun, a 37mm Type 94, could barely penetrate an American Jeep at range, let alone a Sherman. Japanese crews tried to compensate with courage, charging headlong into superior fire, but courage could not rewrite physics. After the battle, American tankers inspected the wrecks with professional curiosity. They compared shell holes, measured armor angles, and tested rounds against the plates. Some Marines even posed for photographs beside the tanks, grinning as they leaned on the shattered turrets. The psychological contrast was striking. American crews well-fed, confident, surrounded by abundance. Japanese crews dead inside machines that had failed them utterly. It wasn't bravery that killed them, Kinney observed. It was ignorance. They didn't know how far behind they were. The destruction of the 9th Tank Regiment had strategic consequences far beyond Saipan. The Imperial Army, now deprived of its last effective armored formation in the Central Pacific, would never again mount a coordinated tank offensive. At Peleliu and Okinawa, the few remaining tanks were dug in as static bunkers, buried up to their turrets, used as glorified machine gun nests. The age of the Japanese tank was over. But on Saipan, the human cost of that realization was unbearable. In the days following the failed counterattack, survivors from the 43rd Infantry Regiment wandered into American lines, dazed and starving. Many were taken prisoner, others begged for death. One captured officer, Lieutenant Yamaguchi, told his interrogators, "We believed our tanks would crush you. We did not understand your strength. When the first ones burned, we knew Japan was finished." His words were prophetic. Saipan's fall in July 1944 would bring the American bombers within range of Tokyo itself. For the Marines, victory came at a price. The island was a furnace of violence. Snipers in caves, civilians trapped between lines, banzai charges that tore through the night. But the memory of that tank assault remained vivid. In quiet moments, tankers cleaned their guns and thought about the men they had killed. Young Japanese soldiers no older than themselves, cooked alive in machines that should never have been sent to war. You stop hating them after a while, Ford admitted years later. You start feeling sorry. They had no chance. Historians would later call the Saipan Counterattack the Pacific's last great tank battle, though it was hardly a battle at all. It was a slaughter, a demonstration of industrial disparity written in fire across a few square miles of coral and cane. The US lost 4 tanks that night, all recoverable. Japan lost 50, every one destroyed. The numbers told a story that no amount of propaganda could conceal. The empire that had once conquered half of Asia could no longer build a tank that could survive 5 seconds under American fire. In Washington, intelligence analysts studied the photographs with fascination. Engineers from Detroit Arsenal examined fragments of armor shipped back from Saipan and concluded that Japanese metallurgy lagged a decade behind. The steel was brittle, poorly tempered, often recycled from scrap. American ordnance officers joked that it was more refrigerator than armor. Behind the humor lay a sobering truth. Japan's industry simply could not compete. The United States had built 50,000 Shermans by mid-1944. Japan's entire wartime tank production across all models would never reach 6,000. The psychological shift among the troops was profound. On Guadalcanal, tanks had been objects of fear. On Saipan, they were targets, visible proof that the tide had turned. For every Marine who survived that night, the sight of burning Hargos symbolized something larger than victory. It represented inevitability. The war would still rage for another year, but the outcome was already written in the smoldering wrecks scattered across that island. When the battle ended, the wreckage remained. Civilians later returning to Saipan found the blackened shells still standing in the fields. Children climbed on them, playing in the twisted hulks. American engineers dragged some into scrap piles. Others were left where they fell, monuments to futility. Even decades later, rusted Hargos could be found buried in the cane fields, their steel frames consumed by salt and time. For the men who had fought there, the memory lingered. At reunions years later, veterans would recall the strange mix of horror and wonder. "You couldn't believe what you were seeing," said one tanker. "A whole regiment, gone in half an hour. We didn't even have time to feel scared." Others remembered the smell, the burning oil, the sharp tang of molten metal, the acrid smoke that clung to their clothes for days. It was the smell of industrial warfare, the scent of a nation's illusions burning away. Japan's army never recovered from Saipan. The loss of its tanks, combined with the destruction of its garrisons, marked the beginning of the end. The empire's generals clung to fantasies of decisive battles, but their soldiers now fought with bamboo spears and desperation. The Americans, armed with mass production and logistics, advanced island by island, methodical and unstoppable. The Hago, once a symbol of Japan's modern power, became a relic of failure, a museum piece before the war was even over. In the aftermath, American correspondents wrote of the battle with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Never has the futility of courage been so clearly displayed," one wrote. "They charged tanks with tanks, but theirs were made of hope and ours of steel." It was a cruel truth, one that even the victors found difficult to celebrate. War had revealed its ultimate logic, that bravery without resources was suicide, and that industry was the real weapon of nations. As the months passed and the war pushed closer to Japan's shores, the lessons of Saipan guided American strategy. The island's capture allowed the construction of airfields for the new B-29 bombers, which would soon blanket Japan's cities in fire. Every Hago destroyed that night had paved the way for that next phase. a war not of soldiers, but of machines. For the few Japanese tankers who survived captivity, Saipan was a memory of shame. One, interviewed years later, said, "Our tanks were our pride. We thought they would show our strength. Instead, they showed our weakness. When I saw the Shermans, I knew the war was lost. It was like seeing the future, metal, endless, merciless. In the end, the Saipan Counterattack became more than a battle. It became a metaphor for the entire Pacific War. The Empire had gambled everything on courage and faith, while America bet on production and science. The result was inevitable. The Hago, brave but doomed, was Japan's story in miniature, a weapon born in ambition, destroyed by reality. The Marines who stood among the wrecks that morning didn't know the full scope of what they'd witnessed. They couldn't see the factories back home, the endless assembly lines in Detroit and Pittsburgh, or the Liberty ships ferrying tanks across oceans faster than Japan could replace a single loss. But they felt it instinctively. "We could have fought for years," Ford said. "They'd never have caught up." The battlefield quieted as the day wore on. The smell of smoke faded, replaced by the sweet rot of tropical air. The dead were buried, the wrecks catalogued, the campaign moved north. But the lesson of that night, when dozens of Hagos charged into oblivion, remained etched in memory. It was the night Japan's armor died, and with it, the last illusion of victory. On Saipan's plains, the wrecks still rust beneath the grass, their steel bones slowly returning to the earth. Tourists sometimes stumble upon them, corroded shapes half buried in the soil. Silent reminders of a war where technology, not valor, decided the fate of nations. The men who fought there are gone now, their stories fading with time. But if you stand among those relics and close your eyes, you can almost hear it again, the rumble of engines, the cries in the dark, and the distant, echoing laughter of the soldiers who realized, for the first time, that the empire of the rising sun was already setting. April 1st, 1945, Okinawa. The rain fell in sheets that turned the coral dust into thick white paste. It coated everything: boots, rifles, the tracks of tanks grinding inland from the beaches. The island smelled of salt and diesel, of mud and death. Along the shore, waves of Marines and soldiers from the 10th Army surged forward, supported by the rumble of Shermans and the thunder of naval guns. Operation Iceberg had begun, the final and bloodiest step before the invasion of Japan itself. Somewhere ahead, hidden in the ridges and caves of the Shuri Line, lay what remained of Japan's armored strength. Fragments of the 27th Tank Regiment and the last Type 95 Hagos still able to fight. They were ghosts of a vanished army, steel relics sent into a storm they could not survive. The first Hago the Americans found lay half buried in a paddy field near the village of Kakazu. Its turret was missing, blown off by a direct hit. A rusted chrysanthemum emblem still clung to the hull. The tank's sides were thin as a man's hand, pocked with holes from shrapnel and .50 caliber rounds. Rainwater filled its open hatches, and inside floated the remnants of what had once been a crew. Sergeant William Callahan, leading a squad from the 96th Infantry Division, stopped beside it. "This thing," he muttered. "They sent this against us?" He ran his hand over the metal and laughed, though the sound came out hollow. Okinawa was not a place for tanks. Its ridges were steep, its trails narrow, its fields soft with rain. Yet the Japanese army had no choice. The 27th Tank Regiment had been shipped from Kyushu months earlier, its strength already depleted. They arrived with 70 light and medium tanks, mostly Hagos, a handful of Type 97 Chiha mediums, and a few obsolete tankettes. Many broke down before even reaching the front. Spare parts were non-existent, fuel was scarce, and every mile driven toward the coast risked discovery by American aircraft. When the battle began, Colonel Fujioka Kamekichi, commanding the regiment, had fewer than 40 running tanks. By the third week of fighting, he had less than half that number. The American advance from the beaches met little resistance at first. Then came the ridges, Yejudak, Shuri, Kakazu, and Conical Hill, each fortified with tunnels and interlocking fields of fire. The Japanese tanks were hidden in caves and bunkers, buried up to their turrets like pillboxes. They no longer maneuvered in the open. They waited in ambush. On April 9th, near Kakazu Ridge, a Hago emerged from a cave to engage a column of Shermans. Its 37mm gun spat fire once, twice, and then the return shot came, a single 75mm round from 50 yards away. It hit dead center. The explosion ripped the little tank apart, flipping it onto its side. The Marines kept advancing. "It didn't even scratch our paint," one tank commander said later. For the Americans, these encounters became routine. The Hagos were less opponents than curiosities. Bazooka teams hunted them for sport, calling in artillery or air strikes to finish the job. On the open ground north of Shuri, one platoon from the 7th Infantry found 5 Japanese tanks hidden under camouflage nets. The soldiers crept within 50 yards and fired a volley of bazooka rounds. Each tank erupted like a furnace, flames spilling from the hatches. "They went up like matchboxes," Private John R. Miller wrote. "You could feel the heat from 50 feet away." By mid-April, Okinawa had become a landscape of wrecks. The roads were lined with shattered armor, Japanese and American alike. But the difference was stark. The Shermans could often be repaired, patched, and returned to battle. The Hagos simply disintegrated. Their armor, little more than welded plate, peeled away under blast pressure. Some tanks were destroyed without a single shell hole visible. Concussive shock alone had split them open. The Marines began calling them paper tanks. Others took to using the wrecks as landmarks. "Turn left past the 2 tin cans," they'd say, meaning the ruined Hagos by the fork in the road. In Tokyo, military planners still clung to delusion. Reports from Okinawa described the regiment's sacrifices in heroic terms. Tanks fighting to the death, crews smiling in flames. But the truth was mechanical, not spiritual. Japan's industry was collapsing. By 1945, steel production had fallen to less than 10% of pre-war levels. Entire factories had been destroyed by bombing. Replacement tanks were built from scrap metal, often without proper heat treatment. Fuel shipments were so scarce that crews siphoned diesel from trucks and aircraft. Some tanks were filled only halfway, sent into battle with just enough fuel for one attack. When the engines stopped, so did the war. At night, the American lines glowed with artillery flashes. The Hagos never reached them. Instead, they died in the shadows, blown apart before they could fire, consumed by napalm dropped from carrier planes, buried under avalanches of coral and mud. When dawn came, soldiers walked among their ruins. The tanks looked ancient, their paint blistered, their tracks half melted into the ground. The rain turned the craters into pools of black water that reflected the sky. You'd see them everywhere, remembered Sergeant Callahan. Just skeletons of tanks. You could tell where the fights had been by how many of them were lying around. As the battle dragged into May, the ground itself seemed to reject the machines. American engineers noted that Okinawa's coral ridges collapsed under the weight of heavy armor, trapping tanks in pits of mud and stone. The Japanese, desperate to make use of every remaining vehicle, converted some Ha-Gos into fixed gun positions. They buried them up to the turret ring, packed sandbags around the hull, and waited. But even as stationary weapons, they were worthless. The 37mm guns couldn't penetrate an American half-track, let alone a Sherman. The gunners fired until the barrels overheated or the tanks caught fire. When the flames came, they stayed in their seats. Among the American troops, a kind of grim fascination took hold. Soldiers began collecting fragments from the destroyed Ha-Gos, rivets, shell casings, pieces of track, to send home as souvenirs. Photographers captured the wrecks in every state of ruin, some still smoldering, others already reclaimed by the jungle. One image showed a Sherman driving past a line of 8 burned-out Japanese tanks, their turrets blown open like empty skulls. The caption simply read, "Okinawa Tank Graveyard." The phrase stuck. Okinawa was more than a battlefield. It was a mausoleum of machines. The island's southern ridges became a vast junkyard of armor, artillery, and corpses. American engineers counted over 100 destroyed Japanese tanks by the end of the campaign, though few were recognizable as such. Many had fused with the coral, their steel warped into grotesque shapes. Others were crushed beneath landslides from the incessant shelling. When the fighting ended in June, entire fields glittered with the remains of shattered war material. Broken tracks, burnt shells, twisted gun barrels. It looked less like victory than excavation. For the Japanese survivors, the loss was unbearable. A captured tanker, interviewed weeks later, said quietly, "We were not soldiers anymore. We were fuel for the fire." His words carried no bitterness, only exhaustion. He described how, during the final days, his comrades drove their last working Ha-Go into a ravine to block an American advance. The tank never fired a shot. Its gun was broken, its ammunition spent. They detonated grenades inside to deny it capture. "It was all we could do," he said. "We had nothing left." American troops, hardened by years of Pacific warfare, felt little triumph in these discoveries. The wrecked tanks were too pitiful to inspire pride. Lieutenant Richard Blake of the 27th Infantry Division wrote in his journal, "They fought with what they had, and what they had was junk." Looking at those tanks, you realize the war's already over for them. They just don't know it yet. His words proved true. The Empire was running on fumes. Each destroyed Ha-Go was a monument to a nation that had run out of both steel and time. By late May, American forces reached the outskirts of Shuri, where the remnants of Japan's defensive line crumbled under bombardment. The 27th Tank Regiment ceased to exist. Of its original 70 tanks, none remained. The few surviving crewmen joined infantry units, fighting with rifles and bayonets. The Japanese command, unwilling to admit defeat, reported that tank operations continue. But on the ground, the tanks were silent. The Okinawa Tank Graveyard was complete. After the surrender in August, U.S. occupation forces catalogued the island's wrecks. The engineer's report listed 123 Japanese armored vehicles destroyed or abandoned, including 48 Ha-Gos. Of those, only 3 were intact enough to transport. One was shipped to Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland for study. The rest were scrapped on site. Their steel was melted down, recycled into reconstruction materials for the very nation that had destroyed them. In the years that followed, Okinawa's landscape changed, but the ghosts remained. Farmers plowing new fields unearthed fragments of tanks, rusted and fragile. Children played around the hulks that still dotted the countryside, unaware of their history. American soldiers stationed on the island during the occupation took photographs beside the wrecks, smiling in front of symbols of a war already fading from memory. For historians, the images became shorthand for Japan's industrial defeat, a visual echo of the larger truth that courage cannot substitute for capacity. The Hago, once the pride of the Imperial Army, ended its life as scrap metal beneath Okinawa's reign. Its 37mm gun, its riveted armor, its narrow tracks, all remnants of an earlier age. It was a weapon conceived in ambition and buried in futility. By 1945, Japan had produced over 2,000 of them. By war's end, none could alter the outcome by an inch. For American soldiers, the wrecks became symbols not of victory, but of contrast. The US could replace every tank lost in a week. Japan could not replace even one. Every burning Hago on Okinawa was a reminder of what industrial war truly meant, a contest of factories, not merely armies. The soldiers who walked among those wrecks sensed it instinctively. You could see who was going to win, Callahan said years later, not from the fighting, but from the machines. Theirs were dying faster than their men. In the months after the battle, correspondents visited the island to document what remained. One wrote, "Okinawa is an island of bones, of men and of metal." The Hagos lay rusting under the same rain that fell on their crews, their steel turning orange and red as though the battle's fire still smoldered inside. In the ruins of Shuri Castle, where Japanese officers had made their last stand, a single tank sat embedded in the rubble, its gun still pointing seaward. The walls around it were blackened, the turret fused in place. No one removed it. It stayed there for years, a monument to both bravery and blindness. When the war ended, the US Navy photographers returned to document the island's transformation. The tanks were still there, half swallowed by the earth, their outlines softened by grass and vines. In one photograph, a Hago's turret pokes from the soil like the shell of a long-dead creature. In another, a group of Okinawan children sit atop a Sherman and a Hago side by side, laughing, unaware that one had symbolized empire and the other liberation. Okinawa's tank graveyard became one of the war's most haunting symbols, the point where machinery and mortality met. Every rivet, every rusted gun barrel told the same story. That Japan's dream of domination had been undone not by lack of courage, but by the arithmetic of industry. The Americans had arrived with endless ships, tanks, and shells. Japan had met them with ghosts. As decades passed, the jungle reclaimed the wrecks. Ferns grew from open hatches. Banyan roots split hulls apart. The coral dust that had once clogged engines now buried them forever. Yet the lesson endured. Military historians studying Okinawa often begin their analyses not with strategy, but with production figures. The United States built 88,000 tanks during the war. Japan built fewer than 6,000. The battle had been decided long before the first shot was fired. For the soldiers who fought there, that knowledge came too late. They remembered the heat, the noise, the smell of burning oil, and the silence afterward. They remembered walking through fields where the ground glittered with shrapnel, and the rain fell softly on the metal graves of their enemies. They remembered realizing, perhaps for the first time, that war was not glory, but ruin. When the survivors of both nations met decades later during commemorations on Okinawa, they stood together at the sites where the tanks still lay. One Japanese veteran, now an old man, rested his hand on the rusted hull of a Hago and whispered, "You died for nothing." An American veteran beside him said nothing. He simply nodded. The Okinawa tank graveyard remains today, somewhere between battlefield and memorial, between history and warning. The Hago's final resting place is not a museum or a parade ground, but the earth itself, where rain and time erase all distinctions between victor and vanquished. What was once steel becomes soil. What was once war becomes memory. For the Americans who first walked that ground in 1945, the sight of those wrecks was more than victory. It was revelation. The same laughter that had begun on Guadalcanal returned here, quieter now, tempered by exhaustion. They laughed not out of mockery, but disbelief, that a nation had sent such fragile machines to fight against a world of steel. It was the laughter of men who had seen too much, who understood that the war was ending because their enemy had nothing left to give. The Hago had begun the Pacific War as a symbol of Japan's modern might. It ended it as rusting debris on a rain-soaked island. In its broken hulls lay the story of an empire's decline, from ambition to desperation, from steel to dust. The Americans who found them didn't need intelligence reports or propaganda to see the truth. It was written on every bullet hole, every melted track, every silent turret staring toward the sea. Okinawa was the grave not just of men, but of illusions. The Hago tanks that once carried Japan's hopes now lie buried under coral and grass, their names forgotten, their purpose erased. But for those who walked among them in that terrible spring of 1945, they told a simple, undeniable story, that the age of empire was over, and that no amount of courage could armor a nation against the weight of industrial reality.